Hey tarot friends, it's Dustin from A Modern Metaphysic Man, and today I thought we could hang out and talk about the 5 tarot decks and tarot related books that I think every tarot student should have. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that I think they're the 5 best books or the only 5 books or anything like that. These are books and decks that I think are a good resource for anyone who really wants to sink their teeth into the tarot should have. I often get asked questions about, what decks do I use to study, what books do I reference, and things like that, because my approach to the tarot is a pretty academic one, right? I love the history of tarot. I study symbolism and occultism. I love to look at art history and how art history has influenced the tarot and things like that. And all together, those things comprise a significant portion of my tarot practice. And so I get asked quite often, what are my recommendations to people who are interested in studying the tarot beyond a beginner's level of just understanding the general meaning of the cards and a little bit about them and how to read them, right? This is really for people who want to sink their teeth into the tarot, understand its origins, understand the different sort of variations of tarot and things like that. So again, this is just my opinion. Take what works for you, leave the rest behind. This is my recommendations of, the 5 decks and the 5 books that I think any serious tarot student should have. So let's start out with decks. The first deck I want to talk about is the Rider-Waite-Smith deck. This is a classic, right? Everyone should have a copy of the Rider-Waite-Smith deck. It doesn't matter which one you have. This is a little bit of a vintage version of the classic yellow box, but you can buy a brand new one of these, right? But the fact of the matter is this is one of the decks that is one of the most influential tarot decks in history, right? So many decks, so many modern decks are based off of this deck and its system. And so having a copy of this to study from, I think is, very, very important. It is a classic, right? Just like we study Shakespeare and Romeo and Juliet, right? This is kind of the tarot equivalent, I would say, or at least one of them, right? So definitely a copy of Arthur Edward Waite and Pamela Coleman Smith, their Rider Tarot deck. Now, again, it doesn't have to be the yellow box. It could be a blue box. It could be a modern one. It could be the Universal Tarot, which is a take on this, right? But just a general RWS. I do think that the classic one is the one to have to study from because so many books reference it. It's good to have, even if you don't like the artwork, right? As far as studying goes, I think this is a great place to start. That being said, right, another great place to start and another sort of seminal classic, as they say in the tarot world, is the Thoth Tarot by the infamous or famous Aleister Crowley. Now, I don't want to get into the debate about Aleister Crowley and all of that fun stuff, but this deck is highly influential on tarot and what tarot has become today. And for that reason, I highly recommend anyone who's interested in studying the tarot, its origins, and diving deeper into the tarot and its meaning, get a copy of this deck. Again, this is a vintage version of the deck, but you can pick up modern printings of this deck. And I'll put links down below to where you can pick up copies of these decks if you're interested in adding them to your collection for the purposes of studying. But, this again is just another classic, right? There's so many decks and systems and books written about this deck that was created by Aleister Crowley and painted by Lady Frida Harris that, if you really want to dig deep into the history and the origins of the tarot, understanding the symbolism and things like that, and being able to apply that to any deck that you get, this is one that you definitely should check out and study, even if you don't like its creator or the artwork. in particular, having it as a study deck has been invaluable to me. I personally love the artwork. I think Lady Frida Harris's artwork is absolutely beautiful, and I actually really enjoy the Thoth system and read quite frequently with a version of the deck, a trimmed version actually. This is the deck that I use most often. It's just a modern copy, trimmed, so all the borders and titles are removed. So I highly recommend this for any tarot student, right? That being said, the third on the list, of course, naturally has to be Tarot de Marseille, right? The historical Marseille is one of the foundation cornerstones of tarot today, right? Marseille is the origins of what we know as the tarot in modern days. Obviously, there's more history than just that, right? And we'll talk about history in a bit when we get to books. But as far as having a deck to study and learn from, I highly recommend the CBD Tarot de Marseille by Yof Bendov. And you know, this is just a really classic sort of take on Marseille. It, you know, obviously is a more modern deck, right? So this, but its imagery and its iconography and all of the symbolism that is present within this deck, you know, is going to carry over into any other Marseille system style deck that you want to use, right? Whether it's a traditional historical Marseille, if you're picking up something like, you know, Il Meneghello deck, or you're picking up something new and modern like the Millennium Marseille or anything like that, right? You know, you're going to be in good shape if you have a good foundational understanding of Marseille. And the CBD is just a great place to start. And Yof Bendov is kind of like a, you know, he's like the Stuart Kaplan of little more recent times, right? He's kind of in, I think, a pivotal turning point in tarot history when it comes to the revitalization and interest in Marseille, which I think is really cool. So yes, CBD Tarot, definitely another deck to have to study from. And this can be any Marseille deck, right? It doesn't necessarily have to be this one. I chose this one because it is really a lot more accessible and easier to find. And again, I'll have a link to this in the description box below. But it's a classic, right? Last but not least is, I feel like I'm gonna sneeze. Well, not last but not least. We have one more after this. This is number 4. But in terms of history and Marseille, I really recommend that everyone have a Visconti Sforza deck. This is a beautiful reproduction of the Visconti Sforza by Il Meneghello, who is a card maker in Italy who hand makes all of his cards, and they're absolutely gorgeous and beautiful, and I love this deck to death. This is a full-size facsimile, and it's beautiful. Now, there are modern versions of this deck produced by Lo Scarabeo and US Games that are easily accessible, but the imagery on these cards are absolutely stunning. And again, these cards have influenced and shaped the course and history of tarot as we know it today. And that being said, this is considered to be one of the oldest and most complete tarot decks that we have access to, in terms of historical tarot decks, right? Tarot being made of paper and cardstock isn't something that stands the test of time very often. And this is one of the oldest ones that was commissioned by the Visconti Sforza family in Italy. And it's, you know, it is, again, a classic with really classic iconography and symbolism. And there's entire books written about this. And it's one of those decks that I think, you know, everyone should have, for sure. So last but not least, the last deck I would recommend This is the one that I struggled the most with because, you know, historical decks are great, right? Obviously, the RWS, the Thoth, the CBD Marseille, and the Visconti's Forza all have very historical significance when it comes to the tarot. But, you know, I think having a modern tarot deck is equally as important. And I landed on this beautiful deck, the Mariel Tarot by Mary White. This deck is really popular, but it is a deck that is a stark departure from any of the other systems that we've talked about, right? RWS, Thoth, Tarot de Marseille, any of those, right? This departs from that. And I think that this is really good when you're studying things like your intuition or reading more into symbolism and things like that, or you're just wanting to learn how to branch away from very traditional systematic styles of reading the tarot. These cards are absolutely gorgeous. The artwork is just stunning, and I love this deck when I read for myself. This is a deck that I personally don't read very often with other people, but it's a deck that I really deeply connected with on a personal level. And I really love it. This is the second edition. I also have the first edition, and I have the first edition of the second edition, which they changed because they had some issues with packaging and stuff like that. But yeah, it's a beautiful deck. The artwork is just amazing. It does follow some very traditional standard tarot kind of systematic things, but again, it's a departure from the standard systems that one might study as a tarot student. So I highly recommend the Mariel Tarot if you don't have that as part of your study repertoire. As far as books go, now everybody knows I love books, right? Love me some books. I have lots of books. When it comes to tarot history, there's tons of amazing options out there. I think studying the history of tarot and understanding its origins as a tarot reader, I think that's important, right? Whenever you go to school to study anything, right, you always study the history of that subject, and tarot is no different, right? So when you're studying tarot, you should definitely study the history. And the book that I often recommend to people is a chunky, dense one, to be honest. I always kind of warn people, but it's The Origins of the Tarot by De Leon. This is a little older now. I don't know if there's a revised edition of this. I looked before I started recording this video. This is the 2009 edition. It's the 9th printing of this book. And there's obviously, you know, some changes and things like that have been, and recent discoveries have been made that have changed a little bit of the narrative within that. But, you know, it's just like any history book, right? But this is a really good book that goes through the history and the origins, as the title is, you know, called, of the tarot, and it does it in a really interesting way. Now, it doesn't go, this really starts at the birth of tarot. It doesn't go all the way back to like the ancient sort of Eastern card games and stuff that made their way through, you know, the Middle East and transformed in the Mamluk and all things like that. A lot of that isn't talked about in here. So if you want that extensive of a history, I wouldn't recommend this book, but this is a really good sort of place to start when it comes to the history of tarot. The Cosmic Evolution and Principles of Immortality. But it's a great book. I highly recommend it. I love it. I flew through this book. It is a little bit more of an academic approach, but it weaves in a lot of esoteric kind of discussion, which I really like, and it talks a lot about different world religions, you know, like Buddhism, Gnosticism, and, you know, Zoroastrian stuff, and how that influenced the tarot, and it's really cool. It's really comprehensive, and I highly, highly recommend this book. Let's see, book 2. Let's talk about primary source material. I'm a big fan of primary source material. I find it fascinating and interesting to see how you know, the meanings of the RWS have changed since its original publication and writing of the book The Pictorial Key to the Tarot by Arthur Edward Waite, the creator. And so I always recommend people to check out primary source material whenever possible when dealing with the tarot. So The Pictorial Key to the Tarot by Arthur Edward Waite, I think, is a must-have for any serious tarot student. This, as you can see, is a very well-worn copy. I've had this copy of the book since I was 16. It's like stained because I've spilled stuff on it and like wrinkled, and it's very loved. This book is very, very loved. But this is one of those things where you're able to read the words directly from the creator, which I think is amazing, right? And it's a really great book. So highly, highly recommend this one. That being said, right, we talked about the RWS and we talked about the Thoth. So of course, Aleister Crowley's The Book of Thoth should also be included in my list. This is a very dense book. Crowley's writing style is dramatic, to say the least. But I love it. It's colorful. There's so much evocative language in this, and it's so dense. When you read something, you literally have to sit there and think about it and like unravel it and unpack it, which I love about it. But it is very dense, but I highly recommend it to anyone who's really studying the tarot. Again, for all of the reasons that I've talked about before. It's a primary source, right? So this is directly from Aleister Crowley in reference to his deck. And so I think, this is definitely a great resource to have. Now, I do want to mention, and I will place links in the description box below, both of these amazing books are available online for free. You don't actually have to go out and buy a physical copy of these books. So if you're short on cash, or you don't like to clutter your space, or whatever, right? You can get these for free, which is really awesome. So I will put links to the more recent editions of these that you can grab on Amazon. And I'll also put links to the free PDF versions of these that are accessible, because they're both in the public domain now, as far as I know, but they're both available on Sacred Texts. So check the description box below if you want to check them out. I personally love the smell of books, and I love holding books, and I love curling up in bed with books and tea. So I always opt for the physical thing. So that's 4. So those are 4 pretty important books in my opinion. Of course, last but not least, we need a Marseille book, right? And to go with the CBD Marseille, I would definitely recommend the Marseille Tarot Revealed by Yov Bendov. Yov Bendov is a prolific writer, and I really feel that he is definitely one of the people in modern times who sort of revitalized people's interests in Tarot de Marseille. I love his writing style. Obviously his books are not huge or thick, but they are full of just really juicy information about Tarot de Marseille. Interestingly enough, he earned his doctorate at Paris 13 University in quantum mechanics. So he's a PhD. And he's a very, very smart person, probably more intelligent than I will ever be. Very huge brain. And I just love the fact that someone who's interested in like quantum theory is interested in tarot, and like how he writes, and it's so good. And so if you're interested in Tarot de Marseille and studying Tarot de Marseille, check out Yov Bendov. He also has another book that's also equally as good. But this is the one that I often give to people when they ask me about, I'm interested in studying Tarot de Marseille, where do I start? This one right here. I do have an honorable mention for books, because I mentioned a modern tarot deck, but I didn't really have like a super modern tarot book that I want to add at the end. But this one is a little bit more modern, but I think it's equally as important, and that is Holistic Tarot. Holistic Tarot is by Bennabelle Wen, who also has a YouTube channel. If you haven't checked it out, I'll put a link in the description box below. She's amazing. She is a lawyer by trade, and this very much is written in like lawyer style. It's very academic. This is not a book that you're going to pick up and read cover to cover. This is a reference book. Now you could read it cover to cover if you wanted to. She also has a tarot course that goes through this book and helps to teach you the tarot. But this book is fantastic, right? There's nothing in here that is like mind-bogglingly, you know, new or anything like that. It's just a very good, concise reference book that she offers her unique insights and perspectives on the tarot, which are always interesting to read. But I love it, and it's well written. It's well compiled. There's tons and I mean, just tons of pictures and charts and reference tables, and just, I mean, just there's so much in here as far as, you know, learning the tarot, studying the tarot, referencing. If you have a correspondence question, anything like that, you're gonna find the answer in this book, especially when it comes to RWS, right? So this is just an amazing reference book for anyone who's studying the tarot, who's, you know, wanting to learn Kabbalic associations or astrological associations, Hebrew letter associations, anything like that. Diving deeper into the RWS, modern interpretations. There's even, I think, a section about associations with the I Ching, if I remember correctly. There's tarot spreads. I mean, very, very comprehensive, an excellent book. I highly recommend it to anyone who is studying the tarot. So my honorable mention for a modern Mariel-esque tarot book is What the Fuck is Tarot? This book is fantastic. It's just it is such a breath of fresh air into the tarot and reading the tarot. When oftentimes when people who are brand new to tarot, they're like, hey, I've always kind of wanted to learn how to read tarot. I'm interested in it. I don't know where to start. This is what I recommend. WTF is tarot, and how do I do it? Right? It's very blunt. It's very Aries, as I like to say, which is kind of my style, obviously being an Aries sun, Cancer moon, right? I'm deep on the inside. But this book, right? This book it's just real. I think that's the best word I can use to describe this book. And it's just such a really great place to start. And anytime I feel like I need to like go back to basics, I'll pick this book up, right? Like, because it just is, it's so grounded when it comes to the meanings of the cards and how to read the tarot and things like that. So I always highly also recommend WTF is Tarot and How Do I Do It. So yeah, those are my books and deck recommendations for anyone who's interested in really sinking their teeth into the tarot, diving into it and learning it from an academic perspective. Again, this is just my opinions and my thoughts and ideas that I wanted to share with all of you. There are tons of other amazing, fantastic, crazy good books that I like and decks that I didn't mention that I wanted to mention. I tried to cut it down. Anything by Rachel Pollack is just gold. You know, Untold Tarot is a fantastic book. There's so many out there, and I hope that at some point I can definitely start including book reviews and things like that on the channel. So if you're interested in that kind of stuff, let me know in the comments below. I would love to hear what decks that you like to study with are, what books you just adore, and if you want to see more things about books on the channel, please let me know in the comments below. As always, thank you all so much for coming to hang out with me and talk about the tarot today. I really appreciate all of your love and support. As always, down below you'll find links to all of the stuff I talked about today, links to my own personal social media where you can reach out and connect with me, and a link to my personal website where you can book a reading with me if that's what you are interested in. Be sure to like and subscribe if you enjoyed today's video, and remember, everyone is fighting a battle that you know nothing about. So be kind always. Bye, everybody.